Andrea Pavlick. She's a 2013-2015 Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Fellow at the Environmental Protection Agency. Andrea came to the program a chemist with a background in the fate and transport of chemicals in the environment. Having a successful fellowship requires exploration and exploitation of your transferable skills and experiences. Andrea has worked in a variety of areas, including groundwater contamination transport, catalyst development for the reduction of NOx emissions in heavy-duty diesel engines, the gas particle partitioning of nicotine and tobacco smoke, the analysis of ambient mercury levels in the greater Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania region, and serving as an engineering specialist in the Peace Corps Technology Transfer Program in Mexico. So, and really, I just want to say the title of her talk, Persistent, Bioaccumulative, and Toxic. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Pavlick.
Hi. First, I would like to say that I speak only for myself. My comments reflect my opinions and do not represent the views of my fellowship host agency. That said, we will now concern ourselves with the regulation of persistent organic pollutants, commonly known as POPs, not the sugar corn variety. These POPs are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. The use of synthetic organic chemicals became widespread after the Second World War, and during the post-war years, there was a positive, forward-looking view about the role of chemistry in our lives, evidenced in the advertising of the era. The use of pesticides expanded to levels never before seen. Pre-1945 U.S. pesticide production was less than 100 million pounds. By 1950, it had tripled, and by 1960, annual production of pesticides was over 600 million pounds. The lawn care ad from the 1950s on the right describes Deldrin as so persistent that a single treatment works for several years and recommends that this pesticide be widely used on parks, athletic fields, private lawns, and pasture lands. Pesticides were also widely used in the indoor environment. Here we see several ads for DDT, once a widely used pesticide that was very successful in controlling insect-borne diseases like malaria and typhus. Like Deldrin, DDT's persistence was a selling point, but the widespread use and often misuse of these chemicals began to raise serious concerns. In the 1950s, DDT was used in a campaign to control gypsy moths, resulting in unintended fish kills, bird deaths, and contaminated food supplies. Deldrin, chlordane, and heptachlor were used on millions of acres to control fire ants. Bird populations were adversely affected. And in the case of Times Beach, Missouri, dioxin contamination from the reuse of hazardous waste oil led to the entire town being evacuated. Many of these chemicals were showing up in fatty tissues at levels of concern as a result of their tendency to bioaccumulate. Perhaps the best known case in the US is the detrimental effect of DDT and its metabolites on bird reproduction, which helped to place bald eagles, peregrine falcons, and brown pelicans on the endangered species list. These toxic, persistent, and bioaccumulative chemicals are commonly found in environments where they have never been used. Chemical contamination is often a local or regional problem, but POPs can be transported long distances and are a global concern. A government cannot reduce risk presented by a globally transported pollutant by banning the chemical if other governments do not also ban the chemical. In 2001, the Stockholm Convention, an international treaty intended to regulate POPs, was negotiated. The convention restricts the manufacture, export, and use of chemicals that present significant hazards. 12 chemicals were placed on the initial list, and additional chemicals have since been added. The newest posting goes on, HBCD, goes into effect in November of this year. And here they are, the original 12, the dirty dozen. Most are pesticides, some are industrial chemicals and byproducts. All are chlorinated organic chemicals. All are toxic, some surprisingly so. DDT is the only chemical of the initial 12 whose use is still allowed under exceptional circumstances. Almost every country in the world is a party to the Stockholm Convention, with the notable exception of the United States. This is the case even though the United States played an active role in negotiating the agreement, and ratification of the treaty has been called for by both the Bush and Obama administrations. Why hasn't the treaty been ratified, you ask? The United States government does not like to ratify treaties that cannot be implemented. Currently, the Toxic Substances Control Act which regulates chemicals, and the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, which regulates pesticides, are not in agreement with provisions of the Stockholm Convention. For example, both TSCA and FIFRA allow chemicals not approved for use in the United States to be manufactured here for export. Congress, therefore, would need to revise the domestic regulation of chemicals identified as persistent organic pollutants to be compliant with the Stockholm Convention. This would help the Senate to facilitate the ratification of the treaty if there was the political will to do so. You might now be wondering what is happening in the U.S. with respect to the Dirty Dozen, given that the U.S. is not a party to the convention that bans them. All of the Dirty Dozen were regulated, restricted, phased out, or had their registrations canceled by 1990, a decade before the convention was negotiated and almost 15 years before it went into effect. As a result of regulations in the US and Europe, POPs levels were decreasing worldwide by 1990. Here we see the concentrations of 6 different POPs in human milk from different regions of the world, showing decreases long before the convention went into effect. So evidence suggests that the Dirty Dozen were well regulated prior to the Stockholm Convention. But what about the newer additions to the POPs list? These chemicals include brominated flame retardants, the active ingredient in Scotchgard, and several more pesticides. If you read the Stockholm Convention listings carefully, you will find more use exemptions among the newer POPs, allowing them to be used when no other alternatives are available. Furthermore, many parties to the convention, including China, India, and Russia, reserved opt-in status, which means that new additions to the convention do not apply in those countries unless the country specifically decides to adopt the restriction. And countries that do not maintain opt-in status can opt out of a POPs listing during a specified time frame before the listing goes into effect. And if that wasn't enough, the convention has no enforcement mechanism. It is a treaty where compliance is somewhat optional that regulates dead chemicals, which begs the question, why would an international agreement be written to regulate chemicals that were already essentially eliminated from the marketplace? Largely to make the barrier to agreement and consensus as low as possible to encourage widespread adoption of the convention. And the Stockholm Convention does help to control the use of POPs, especially in developing countries, effectively reducing the global environmental burden of persistent organic chemicals. It provides funds to help countries manage chemical stockpiles and to use and dispose of chemicals safely. It indicates to governments and industry that a chemical is essentially blacklisted by the global community. Does it matter, really, that the U.S. is not a party to the Stockholm Convention? By not ratifying the convention, the United States is limited to observer status in meetings and potentially risks its reputation as a world leader and global partner in chemical pollution and other environmental issues. However, in terms of chemical regulation, the U.S. has taken steps to control the use of every chemical listed under the Stockholm Convention, often years before the chemical was listed. I know I've spent a good bit of time highlighting the limitations of the Stockholm Convention as a means to regulate persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic chemicals, but its strength is that it continues to achieve widespread international consensus concerning a global chemical threat.